Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York. His parents, Gabrielle and Teresina Capone, were Italian immigrants who had arrived in America just a few years earlier, seeking a better life. They settled in a cramped apartment in the rough neighborhood of Navy Yard, where crime and poverty were as much a part of daily life as hard labor. Gabriele, a barber, worked long hours to support his growing family, while Teresina managed the household, raising 9 children in an unforgiving environment. From a young age, Capone understood the rules of the streets. Respect was earned through strength, survival required adaptability, and authority was either obeyed or challenged. He attended Public School 7, where he performed well enough in his early years, but the rigid discipline of the classroom never suited him. Authority figures demanded obedience, but on the streets, respect was won differently. By the age of 14, Capone had already absorbed the realities of Brooklyn's underworld. Street gangs ruled the neighborhoods, enforcing their own codes of conduct, and young boys either followed the rules or found themselves at the mercy of those who did. It was during this time that Capone's education came to an abrupt end. After a teacher struck him for misbehaving, he retaliated, hitting back with the same force that would later define his rise to power. His expulsion from school was inevitable, and with no intention of returning, he sought opportunity elsewhere. Without the structure of formal education, Capone turned to the streets for guidance. He found work running errands and performing small jobs, but it wasn't long before he caught the attention of local gangsters. Small-time criminals recognized his potential. He had the size, the strength, and, more importantly, the willingness to do what others hesitated to do. During his teenage years, he became involved with various street gangs, starting with the Junior 40 Thieves and the Bowery Boys. These groups operated on the fringes of organized crime, engaging in petty theft, street fights, and extortion. Capone quickly adapted, proving himself as someone who could handle pressure. He learned how to intimidate without speaking, how to read an opponent's next move, and how to strike first when necessary. By the time he reached his late teens, Capone had drawn the attention of Johnny Torrio's 5 Points Gang, one of the most notorious criminal organizations in New York. The 5 Points Gang controlled illegal gambling, prostitution, and racketeering operations across the city. It was an organization that demanded loyalty, discipline, and a willingness to follow orders. Capone, eager for more than small-time crime, saw this as an opportunity to move beyond the street-level fights and into something far more lucrative. His first real introduction to the world of organized crime came through Frankie Yale, a known gangster who ran several illegal enterprises, including bars and brothels. Yale took Capone under his wing, giving him work as a bouncer at the Harvard Inn, a bar on Coney Island known for its rowdy clientele. It was here that Capone learned how to manage business through force, how to handle drunks with diplomacy or violence, and how to recognize when a situation required one over the other. The Harvard Inn wasn't just a bar. It was a breeding ground for young criminals looking to make a name for themselves. It was where debts were collected, alliances were formed, and lessons in power were taught through bloodshed. Capone observed how the older gangsters operated by how they handled money and how they maintained control over their territories. He saw firsthand that strength alone wasn't enough. Intelligence and strategy mattered just as much. Capone had already developed a reputation for his temper, but he also understood when to hold back. He was still young, still learning. He knew that patience, listening, and understanding the structure of power were just as important as knowing when to throw a punch. It was only a matter of time before his reputation caught up with him in a way that would leave a permanent mark on his life and his face. The Harvard Inn was never quiet. Every night, gamblers, drunks, and gangsters filled the bar, their conversations blending with the clinking of glasses and the shouts of men settling disputes with fists. Frankie Yale's establishment was more than just a drinking spot. It was a place where business was conducted, where alliances were made, and where reputations were destroyed with a single misstep. Al Capone had been working there for some time, acting as a bouncer and bartender. His job was to keep order, throw out troublemakers, and make sure Yale's interests were protected. He had already proven himself as someone who could handle a fight, someone who could break a man's nose with a single punch. But he was still young. He was still learning the boundaries of power. One night, a mistake changed everything. Capone spotted a woman at one of the tables, her dark dress elegant under the dim lights, her presence commanding attention. He was never shy, and with the confidence of a young man who had already seen more than most his age, he leaned in and made a comment. Some say it was a flirtation, others claim it was more crude. Whatever he said, it was enough to enrage the man sitting beside her. Frank Galluccio was not the type of man to tolerate disrespect, especially when it involved his sister. Before Capone could react, Galluccio pulled a knife and slashed him 3 times across the left side of his face. The attack was swift, the blade cutting deep, slicing from his cheekbone down to his jaw. Blood poured onto his shirt, pain searing through his skin. The room fell silent as Capone staggered back, his hands instinctively clutching his face, but he did not fight back. He did not reach for a weapon. He understood that in this moment he had made a mistake, one that could cost him far more than a scar. The incident should have ended in further violence. Capone was humiliated, but he knew retaliation was not an option, not against a man connected to the same underworld he was trying to rise through. Word of the attack spread quickly, reaching Frankie Yale himself. Rather than escalating the situation, Yale stepped in to settle it. He arranged a sit-down between Capone and Galluccio, forcing Capone to apologize for his words. Galluccio, satisfied with his revenge, let the matter rest. The scars never faded. They became part of his identity, a reminder that in the world he was entering, words could be as dangerous as bullets. The newspapers would later call him Scarface, a nickname he despised. To those who knew him personally, he preferred Snorky, a term for someone sharp and well-dressed. But the scars told a different story. They gave him a permanent mark of violence, a face that could never be mistaken for an ordinary man's. Capone never spoke much about the incident. He never corrected the stories that circulated, never admitted that the scars had come from a moment of reckless youth rather than a battle in the streets. He had learned a lesson that night, one that would shape how he carried himself in the years to come. Violence had to be controlled. Mistakes had consequences. And in a world where power meant survival, appearances could be just as important as actions. The young bouncer with the slashed face was no longer just another street thug. He was a man marked by blood. A man who would not make the same mistake twice. Brooklyn had taught Capone how to fight, but Manhattan would teach him how to control power. The 5 Points Gang was not just another street gang. It was a criminal organization with influence stretching across the city. Its leader, Johnny Torrio, understood that brute force alone was not enough. The real money came from controlling businesses, corrupting officials, and ensuring that every operation ran with efficiency. Capone had already proven he could handle himself in a brawl, but under Torrio's influence, he learned that intimidation, loyalty, and strategy mattered just as much as strength. Capone's introduction to the gang came through Frankie Yale, who recognized his potential and arranged for him to work under Torrio's men. The 5 Points Gang controlled gambling houses, brothels, and protection rackets. They had connections with city politicians and law enforcement, ensuring that their illegal operations could continue without interference. Unlike the street gangs he had been part of before, this was organized crime at a different level. His first tasks were simple but dangerous. Collecting debts from men who had no intention of paying, intimidating business owners who resisted paying for protection, and ensuring that the gang's brothels ran without disruption. He did not hesitate. When he knocked on a man's door, he did not have to explain why he was there. His reputation did the talking. If persuasion failed, force followed. Torrio watched closely. He needed men who could follow orders but also knew how to think. Capone proved he was both. He knew when to push and when to hold back, when to negotiate and when to send a message. His loyalty never wavered. He was willing to do whatever was necessary to protect the gang's interests. The 5 Points Gang controlled a vast network of criminal enterprises, but they also had rivals. New York's underworld was filled with competing factions, each fighting for dominance. Capone was involved in several violent confrontations, earning a reputation for his fearlessness. He was not reckless. He was calculating. He understood that killing without purpose attracted the wrong kind of attention. Every action had to serve a larger goal. By the time he was 19, Capone had already established himself as one of Torrio's most reliable enforcers. He was no longer just a bouncer at the Harvard Inn or a street thug looking for his next fight. He was moving up, gaining the respect of men who controlled the city's criminal empire. But Torrio had bigger plans that would take him beyond New York. He had already begun setting up operations in Chicago, a city where the opportunities were greater, the laws more lenient, and the money endless. He needed men he could trust. Capone had proven himself in the 5 Points gang, but New York was already crowded with powerful men. Chicago, on the other hand, was a city ready for the taking. New York had shaped Capone, but Chicago would define him. The move was not his choice, it was Johnny Torrio's. Torrio had been steadily expanding his criminal empire in the Windy City, working under Big Jim Colosimo, a powerful mob boss who controlled the city's brothels, gambling dens, and protection rackets. But Colosimo was old-fashioned. He resisted change, hesitant to expand into new opportunities, particularly the lucrative business of bootlegging. Torrio saw Prohibition as the future. He needed men who understood power, men who would not hesitate when the time came. In 1919, Capone left New York and arrived in Chicago, bringing with him the lessons he had learned in the 5 Points gang. He was no longer a small-time enforcer. He was Torrio's right-hand man, a trusted soldier in a city with endless possibilities. At first, he kept a low profile, working in the background, running errands for Torrio, overseeing gambling houses, and handling disputes with the same mix of charm and violence that had made him valuable in New York. Chicago was different. It was bigger, wilder, and more corrupt. The politicians and police were just as involved in crime as the gangsters themselves. Bribes determined who was arrested and who walked free. Power was not just about muscle, it was about influence, about knowing the right people and making the right moves. Capone adapted quickly. He built relationships with key figures, understanding that in this city, alliances were just as important as firepower. His presence did not go unnoticed. The newspapers were already beginning to whisper about the young man from Brooklyn, the enforcer with the scars who had come to Chicago under Torrio's protection. He was careful, but he was also ambitious. He knew that working for Torrio was only the beginning. The turning point came in 1920, when Torrio decided it was time to remove the last obstacle standing in his way: Big Jim Colosimo. Colosimo had built Chicago's underworld, but he was now a liability. He refused to embrace the bootlegging business, fearing it would bring too much heat from law enforcement. Torrio had no patience for hesitation. He needed a man who understood the future, a man willing to act. On May 11, 1920, Colosimo was lured to his restaurant under the pretense of a business meeting. He waited alone, unaware that his fate had already been decided. A gunman entered and fired a single bullet, ending his reign in an instant. Some say it was Frankie Yale who pulled the trigger. Others believe Capone was involved. The truth remained in the shadows, known only to those who had ordered the hit. With Colosimo gone, Torrio assumed full control of Chicago's underworld, and Capone's rise accelerated. He was no longer just an enforcer. He was now Torrio's most trusted lieutenant, overseeing the city's expanding criminal empire. Prohibition had created a new kind of business, and Capone was ready to seize the opportunity. Chicago belonged to them now. But power, once gained, always had to be defended. Prohibition had transformed Chicago into a battlefield. The Volstead Act had made the sale and production of alcohol illegal, but it had also created an opportunity unlike any before. The demand for liquor did not disappear. It only went underground. Those who could control its supply would control the city. Johnny Torrio understood this, and so did Capone. With Colosimo out of the way, Torrio wasted no time in restructuring Chicago's criminal operations. He expanded the city's network of speakeasies, illegal breweries, and smuggling routes, ensuring that alcohol flowed freely despite the government's attempts to stop it. Corrupt politicians and police officers were paid handsomely to look the other way. Judges were bought. Informants were silenced. Capone oversaw much of this expansion, managing shipments, ensuring that speakeasies received their supply and dealing with anyone who posed a threat to the operation. He understood that violence was necessary, but it had to be calculated. Every act of brutality had to serve a purpose. Every bullet fired had to send a message. The profits were staggering. What had once been a collection of small-time gambling and prostitution rings had now become a multi-million-dollar enterprise. But with success came enemies. Chicago was not unclaimed territory. The North Side, controlled by the Irish-American gang led by Dean O'Banion, was one of the most dangerous rival factions. O'Banion had no intention of allowing Torrio and Capone to dominate the bootlegging trade without a fight. The battles between Torrio's outfit and O'Banion's gang were not immediate. At first, there was an uneasy truce. Territory was divided, and business operated with a fragile understanding. But tensions simmered beneath the surface. Hijackings of liquor shipments became common. Murders were disguised as accidents. And Capone, watching closely, knew that the peace would not last. During these years, Capone's reputation grew. Unlike Torrio, who preferred to stay in the shadows, Capone embraced his rising influence. He was seen in public, dressed in tailored suits, dining at the best restaurants, surrounded by politicians and celebrities who understood that in Chicago, power no longer belonged to the law. It belonged to those who controlled the flow of money and liquor. Yet, despite his growing wealth and influence, Capone remained fiercely loyal to Torrio. He was still learning, still absorbing the lessons of organized crime at the highest level. He knew that patience was key, but he also knew that power, once gained, could never be shared for long. The streets of Chicago were changing. Bootlegging had made men rich, but it had also made them reckless. And in a city where ambition was the only law, it was only a matter of time before blood was spilled. The uneasy truce between Torrio's outfit and Dean O'Banion's North Side gang was bound to fail. Both sides wanted control, and in Chicago, power was never shared for long. O'Banion was bold, unpredictable, and, most importantly, he had connections. Police officers, judges, and politicians who weren't on Torrio's payroll. Worse, he had no fear of provoking the South Side operation. For months, O'Banion had been interfering with Torrio's business, hijacking shipments, encroaching on territory, and undermining the fragile order that kept the city's underworld from turning into open war. But his biggest mistake was double-crossing Torrio himself. In May 1924, O'Banion sold Torrio a brewery, a seemingly routine transaction. What Torrio didn't know was that O'Banion had tipped off the authorities. The moment Torrio took ownership, federal agents raided the brewery, arresting him for violating Prohibition laws. The fine was heavy, but the insult was worse. Torrio was furious. In the world of organized crime, betrayals were never forgiven. Capone had learned from his mentor that patience was key, but even patience had limits. The decision was made. O'Banion had to go. On the morning of November 10, 1924, O'Banion was tending to business at his flower shop, Schofield's, a front for his criminal operations. He was watering flowers when three men entered, posing as customers. One of them extended his hand for a friendly shake. When O'Banion reached out, the grip tightened. Too firm, too deliberate. Before he could react, gunfire erupted. 6 shots were fired. O'Banion was dead before he hit the floor. Chicago's underworld erupted. The assassination shattered the balance of power, plunging the city into full-scale gang warfare. The North Side, now led by Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran, vowed revenge. They were more ruthless than O'Banion, more organized, and they had one goal: destroy Torrio and Capone. The retaliation was swift. Torrio's businesses were targeted, his men gunned down in the streets. His enemies wanted him dead, and they nearly succeeded. On January 24, 1925, Torrio was ambushed outside his home. As he stepped out of his car, gunmen opened fire, striking him multiple times in the chest, neck, and arm. He collapsed, barely conscious, blood pooling beneath him. But the final shot never came. Weiss and Moran had sent a message. They could have killed him, but they wanted him to suffer. Torrio survived. After months in the hospital and a brief stint in prison, he made a decision that stunned everyone. He was done. Chicago had become too violent, too unstable. The man who had built the empire was walking away. He gathered his wealth, left the city, and retired to New York, leaving behind the kingdom he had created. And in his place, he left one man in charge: Al Capone. With Johnny Torrio gone, the full weight of Chicago's criminal empire fell onto Al Capone's shoulders. At just 26 years old, he was now the most powerful mob boss in the city. He had inherited not just Torrio's businesses, but his enemies, his responsibilities, and the constant threat of violence that came with power. But Capone was not just another gangster. He was something more. He understood the importance of public image, the necessity of calculated brutality, and the value of loyalty. His first move was to consolidate power. Torrio had always preferred to operate from the shadows, keeping a low profile and letting others take the spotlight. Capone did the opposite. He made himself known, appearing in the best restaurants, walking the streets of Chicago without bodyguards, and presenting himself as a businessman rather than a criminal. He wore expensive suits, dined with politicians, and donated to charities. The public saw him as a modern-day Robin Hood, a man who provided jobs and kept the city's speakeasies running. But beneath the polished exterior, Capone was ruthless. He knew that the North Side Gang, now led by Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran, would never forgive the murder of O'Banion. The war had begun, and it would only end when one side was completely wiped out. The violence escalated quickly. The streets of Chicago became a battleground, with drive-by shootings, bombings, and ambushes becoming a part of daily life. Capone struck first, ordering hits on key members of the North Side operation. But Weiss and Moran fought back with equal ferocity, targeting Capone's men, his businesses, and even attempting to assassinate him. One of the most brazen attacks came in September 1926. Capone was staying at the Hawthorne Inn, his headquarters in Cicero, when a convoy of North Side gunmen armed with Thompson submachine guns drove past and sprayed the building with over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. The attack was meant to kill him, but Capone escaped unharmed. Instead of retreating, he used the incident to solidify his image as a survivor, a man who could not be taken down even by a full-scale assault. Capone responded with even more aggression. He tightened his grip on the city, eliminating anyone who stood in his way. Those who resisted were either bought off or gunned down. His organization expanded, controlling not just bootlegging but gambling, prostitution, and even city officials. He had judges, police officers, and politicians on his payroll, ensuring that no matter how many crimes he committed, he remained untouchable. By the end of 1926, it was clear that Capone was no longer just another gangster. He was the undisputed ruler of Chicago's underworld. He had taken Torrio's empire and turned it into something even greater, a criminal organization that operated like a corporation. But as his power grew, so did the threats against him. Capone had built his empire on violence, but he knew that no empire lasted forever. The war was not over. The North Side was still standing. And in Chicago, there was only one way to end a war. Capone had spent years waging war against the North Side Gang, but no matter how many men he had killed, they refused to disappear. Jaime Weiss had been gunned down in 1926, but his successor, Bugs Moran, was just as dangerous. The battles between Capone's outfit and Moran's crew had turned Chicago into a war zone. Bootlegging shipments were hijacked. Men were ambushed in broad daylight. Bodies piled up in the streets, and the newspapers called it an epidemic of gangland violence. By 1929, Capone was tired of the constant fighting. He needed a definitive strike, one that would cripple the North Side Gang beyond repair. And so, a plan was set in motion. On the morning of February 14, 1929, 7 members of Bugs Moran's gang gathered in a garage on North Clark Street. They believed they were about to receive a shipment of stolen liquor, a routine deal in the world of bootlegging. But this was no ordinary transaction. It was a setup. Shortly after 10:30 a.m., a Cadillac pulled up outside. 4 men stepped out. 2 of them dressed as police officers, the others in civilian clothing. The officers stormed into the garage, ordering Moran's men to line up against the wall. Believing it was a routine raid, they complied without resistance. Then the gunfire erupted. The gunmen opened fire with Thompson submachine guns, unleashing nearly 70 bullets in a matter of seconds. The execution was brutal, methodical. Not a single man was left alive. When the shooting stopped, the killers calmly walked out, climbed back into their car, and drove away. The massacre sent shockwaves through Chicago. The press had covered gangland killings before, But nothing like this. Photos of the blood-soaked garage hit the front pages of every newspaper in the country. The public, once entertained by the stories of gangsters, now saw the true horror of organized crime. But there was one problem. Bugs Moran wasn't among the dead. He had been running late that morning and had narrowly escaped the trap. Furious and humiliated, he publicly blamed Capone, calling him a coward who only killed men from a distance. Capone, conveniently in Florida at the time, denied any involvement. He knew the importance of maintaining plausible deniability. But whether he had given the direct order or not, the message was clear. There was no one left to challenge his rule. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre cemented Capone's reputation as the most powerful gangster in America. He had achieved what no one else had. He had broken the North Side Gang, but in doing so, he had also made himself the most wanted man in the country. The federal government had tolerated Capone's crimes for years, but this was different. The massacre had pushed public opinion too far. Politicians who had once turned a blind eye could no longer afford to ignore him. The police, pressured by Washington, intensified their efforts to bring him down. Capone had won the war, but he had also made himself a target. The walls were closing in, and this time, bullets wouldn't be what took him down. Capone had eliminated his biggest rival, but in doing so, he had drawn the full attention of the U.S. government. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre had been too public, too brutal. For years, Chicago's law enforcement had been riddled with corruption, with officials on Capone's payroll ensuring he remained untouchable. But now the federal government was stepping in. President Herbert Hoover himself had taken notice. He wanted Capone behind bars, and he wanted it done legally. No street executions, no gangland retribution. The challenge was clear. Capone was too well protected to be convicted of violent crimes. Witnesses disappeared, juries were bought, and every attempt to charge him with murder or bootlegging ended in failure. If they wanted to take him down, they had to find another way. Enter Eliot Ness. Ness was a young, ambitious federal agent determined to bring Capone to justice. He formed a special team, nicknamed the Untouchables, agents who could not be bribed or intimidated. Their mission was simple: cripple Capone's operations by targeting his breweries, speakeasies, and supply lines. They raided warehouses, smashed liquor shipments, and disrupted the flow of money that kept Capone's empire running. But despite the chaos Ness caused, Capone remained free. Then came the real breakthrough. Capone's greatest weakness wasn't his guns, his enemies, or his crimes. It was his money. While Capone had made millions through illegal enterprises, he had never filed proper tax returns. The government realized they didn't need to prove he had ordered murders or controlled bootlegging rings. They only needed to prove he had evaded taxes. If they could show that Capone had made vast amounts of money without paying the government its share, they could put him away for good. Federal investigators combed through his financial records, searching for any evidence of undeclared income. It was a slow, meticulous process, but eventually they found what they needed. Capone's own bookkeepers had kept ledgers detailing the millions in illegal earnings, never suspecting those records would one day be used against him. In June 1931, the government finally made its move. Capone was indicted on 22 counts of tax evasion. The charges might not have had the drama of bootlegging or murder, but they were enough to take him down. Capone laughed off the case at first. He had bribed juries before, intimidated witnesses, and walked away from every legal battle he had faced. But this time, things were different. The government wasn't playing by the old rules. Federal prosecutors had built an airtight case, and the judge wasn't on Capone's payroll. As the trial approached, Capone's confidence began to crack. He had always relied on fear and influence to stay ahead, but neither could help him now. The man who had ruled Chicago with an iron fist was about to face something he had never truly feared before: justice. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, government officials, and spectators all crowded in, waiting to witness the trial of the most infamous gangster in America. For years, Al Capone had ruled Chicago with impunity, walking free while bodies piled up in the streets. But now, the government had him where they wanted him, not on charges of murder, extortion, or bootlegging, but for something far more mundane: tax evasion. At first, Capone remained defiant. He smirked through the proceedings, confident that his usual tactics of bribery and intimidation would secure his freedom. He had arranged to have the jury in his pocket, just as he had done in the past. But this time, the government was one step ahead. On the morning of the trial, the judge ordered a last-minute jury switch, replacing Capone's hand-picked jurors with an entirely new panel, one he had no control over. The game had changed. Over the course of the trial, the prosecution presented irrefutable evidence of Capone's massive illegal income and his failure to